he's incredibly talented. It really captures the mood.
There are professions that create particular relationship to urban geography and to the accumulated knowledge of how cities function at ground level, where success depends less on abstract understanding of systems and more on intimate familiarity with specific streets and traffic patterns and the countless small variables that determine whether a route will be efficient or disastrous on any given day at any given time. Professional driving is such a profession. Requires not just technical ability to operate vehicles safely but also sophisticated mental map of the city's road network and ongoing awareness of how that network's performance fluctuates based on time of day and weather conditions and special events and construction projects and the innumerable other factors that transform theoretical routes into actual lived experience of moving through urban space under specific circumstances. Rohan Mehta had been working as professional driver in San Veritas for 15 years, had accumulated during that time the kind of practical geographic knowledge that no GPS system could fully replicate. That came only from years of actually navigating the city's streets under varying conditions and gradually building mental database of which routes worked reliably and which routes looked efficient on maps but proved problematic in practice. He was 41 years old, had started driving professionally at 26 after previous career in restaurant management had proved unsustainable due to combination of demanding hours and interpersonal stress that had made the work feel exhausting in ways that extended beyond just physical fatigue. The transition to professional driving had been motivated initially by practical necessity. He'd needed income after leaving the restaurant industry, had possessed valid driver's license and clean driving record and had seen job posting for driver position that seemed accessible without requiring extensive retraining or credentials. But what had started as temporary employment solution had gradually become career that Rohan found surprisingly satisfying, that provided income adequate to support modest lifestyle while also offering autonomy and variety that his restaurant work had lacked, that allowed him to interact with diverse range of people without requiring the sustained interpersonal intensity that had been draining about restaurant management. San Veritas was mid-sized city, population approximately 800,000 in the city proper, perhaps 1.5 million in the broader metropolitan area, located in temperate coastal region where weather was generally mild but where occasional heavy rain could create significant traffic disruptions. The city's layout reflected its history, older downtown core with irregular street grid that had developed organically over 19th and early 20th centuries, surrounded by more recent suburban development with more regular planning but also with increasing sprawl that created longer commute times for people living in outlying areas and working in the city center. The traffic patterns in San Veritas were complex but followed predictable rhythms that experienced drivers learned to anticipate. Morning rush hour typically ran from approximately 7 a.m. to 9:30 a.m., with peak congestion around 8:15 a.m. when most traditional office workers were commuting. Evening rush hour ran from approximately 4:30 p.m. to 7 p.m., with peak congestion around 5:45 p.m. Midday traffic was generally lighter but could become congested around specific destinations like shopping districts or medical centers. Weekend traffic followed different patterns, lighter overall but with specific congestion points around recreational destinations and retail areas. Rohan had developed sophisticated understanding of these patterns, knew which routes were reliable during which times and which routes should be avoided even when they appeared efficient on paper. He knew which traffic lights had problematic timing that could add minutes to journey if you hit them at wrong moment. He knew which intersections became bottlenecks during peak hours and which alternative routes could bypass those bottlenecks effectively. He knew where construction projects were currently active and how long those projects were expected to continue. He knew which streets had parking restrictions that affected traffic flow during certain hours. This accumulated knowledge was what distinguished experienced professional drivers from novices who might have technical driving skills but who lacked the geographic and temporal awareness that made the difference between efficient and frustrating journey. His primary client for the past 3 years had been Priya Desai, journalist who worked for San Veritas Chronicle covering mix of local politics and human interest stories and who relied on Rohan to provide reliable transportation to interviews and events and other professional obligations that required travel around the city and occasionally into surrounding communities. Priya was 36 years old, had been working in journalism for approximately 12 years, had developed reputation as thorough reporter who produced well-researched feature stories that went beyond surface coverage to explore underlying human dimensions of the situations she covered. Their professional relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship, though both maintained appropriate boundaries given the employer-employee dynamics that structured their interaction. They developed comfortable working rhythm. Priya would provide Rohan with schedule of where she needed to be and when. Rohan would plan routes and timing to ensure reliable arrivals. They'd engage in casual conversation during drives that ranged from discussion of current events to personal updates about their respective lives. Rohan appreciated that Priya treated him as professional colleague rather than as service worker whose labor should be invisible, that she engaged with him as person with his own perspectives and experiences rather than just as driver whose only relevance was his ability to transport her efficiently. The Wednesday morning in question, October 19th, unseasonably overcast with gray clouds that suggested possible rain though none had yet materialized, began with scheduled pickup at Priya's apartment building at 7:45 a.m. for drive to interview appointment on opposite side of the city that was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. The appointment was with city council member who was considering run for mayor and who had agreed to early breakfast interview before his official workday began. The interview location was restaurant in the downtown core, approximately 8.5 miles from Priya's apartment in the Riverside neighborhood, journey that would typically require 25 to 35 minutes depending on traffic conditions and route selection. Rohan arrived at Priya's building at 7:43 a.m., 2 minutes earlier than the scheduled pickup time, following his standard practice of building slight buffer to ensure punctuality even if unexpected delays occurred during his own commute to the pickup location. Priya emerged from the building at 7:46 a.m., carrying her usual professional bag containing laptop and recording equipment and the various materials she needed for conducting interviews. She settled into the back seat. Rohan had learned she preferred back seat rather than front passenger seat during work-related drives, seemed to use the time for reviewing notes or making phone calls related to her work, and confirmed the destination and timing as Rohan pulled away from the curb and began navigating toward the downtown area. Rohan's initial route plan was straightforward and reliable. Take Riverside Boulevard north for approximately 2 miles, merge onto Highway 17 for quick 3-mile stretch that bypassed the most congested surface streets, exit onto Montgomery Street which would take them directly into downtown and to the restaurant where Priya's interview was scheduled. This route was one he'd used dozens of times for similar morning appointments, knew it performed consistently well during this time period, expected it would deliver them to the destination with comfortable time margin before the 9 a.m. interview start. But as they proceeded north on Riverside Boulevard approaching the Highway 17 entrance, Rohan noticed that traffic was moving more slowly than typical for this time on a Wednesday morning. Not stopped completely, vehicles were still progressing forward, but moving at maybe 15 to 20 miles per hour rather than the 35 to 40 miles per hour that characterized normal flow on this stretch. The slowdown could be temporary fluctuation that would clear once they got past whatever minor disruption was causing it, or could be indicator of more serious congestion ahead that would make the highway route problematic. Rohan had developed instinct over his 15 years of professional driving for reading these kinds of ambiguous traffic situations, for distinguishing between minor slowdowns that were worth proceeding through and more serious congestion that was worth avoiding through alternative routes even when those alternatives weren't obviously faster on paper. The instinct wasn't infallible. Sometimes he'd choose alternative route only to discover that original route cleared up and that the alternative was actually slower, but it was reliable enough that he trusted it more than he trusted GPS systems that calculated routes based on typical patterns rather than on real-time conditions as interpreted through experienced drivers' judgment. In this moment, Rohan's instinct was telling him that the Highway 17 route was going to be problematic, that whatever was causing the current slowdown was likely to get worse rather than better, that an alternative route through surface streets might be more reliable even though it would involve more turns and traffic lights. The alternative he was considering: turn right onto Ashford Street in approximately 2 blocks, take Ashford East through the Warehouse District, connect to Martin Luther King Boulevard which would angle northeast back toward downtown, was route he knew reasonably well but that he didn't use frequently for morning commutes because it typically involved more stop and go at traffic lights compared to the highway option. But something about the current traffic conditions was triggering his sense that today the surface street route would be better choice. He couldn't articulate exactly what was generating that sense, was combination of the slower than normal traffic flow, the time of morning, maybe some unconscious pattern recognition based on similar situations he'd encountered before, but the sense was strong enough that he decided to trust it rather than proceeding with the originally planned route. "I'm going to take a different route this morning," Rohan said, glancing at Priya in the rearview mirror to gauge her reaction. Traffic's looking heavier than normal on the highway approach. I think we'll do better going through the warehouse district. Priya looked up from her phone where she'd been reviewing notes. You're sure? The GPS says the highway route is fastest. Trust me, Rohan replied with the quiet confidence that came from years of successful route decisions. The GPS doesn't know what I'm seeing right now. We'll save time this way. Priya nodded acceptance. She'd learned over their 3 years of working together that Rohan's route judgment was generally reliable, that questioning his decisions usually just led to him explaining his reasoning without changing his choice, that it was more efficient to trust his expertise than to second-guess it. Okay, you're the expert. Rohan made the right turn onto Ashford Street, departing from the familiar Riverside Boulevard route and committing to the alternative Surface Street approach. The turn felt both routine, just another navigation decision of the type he made dozens of times daily, and somehow significant in ways he couldn't quite identify, like some part of his awareness was recognizing that this particular turn would matter more than most routine route adjustments, even though he had no conscious reason to think that would be the case. Ashford Street ran east through the warehouse district, a neighborhood that had been San Veritas's industrial and shipping center during the early to mid-20th century, but that had gradually transitioned as manufacturing and shipping operations had relocated or closed, leaving behind large brick warehouse buildings that were being converted to various contemporary uses: artist lofts, small businesses, restaurants and cafes serving the creative class workers who were moving into the area as it gentrified. The street itself was wider than typical residential streets but narrower than major arterials, featured older concrete pavement with occasional patches where repairs had been made, was lined with mature trees that created canopy effect during seasons when leaves were present, though in late October most leaves had already fallen. The traffic on Ashford was light, moving at reasonable pace without the congestion that had been developing on Riverside Boulevard. Rohan felt validation of his route decision. If they'd continued toward the highway, they'd probably be sitting in increasingly slow traffic right now, whereas this alternative was allowing steady progress. The validation was satisfying but not particularly surprising. His route instincts were usually correct. This was just normal confirmation of judgment he'd already trusted enough to act on. They proceeded east on Ashford for approximately a mile, passing the converted warehouses and the various small businesses that occupied ground floor spaces, passing occasional pedestrians and cyclists using the neighborhood sidewalks and bike lanes. The area had different character than the residential neighborhoods they'd been in earlier or the downtown core they were heading toward. Was more industrial in its aesthetic, even as that industrial character was being overlaid with contemporary creative economy uses, had mixture of old and new that created visual interest if you were paying attention, but that could also seem slightly dilapidated or marginal if you were just passing through without engagement. At the intersection with Portola Avenue, Rohan turned left to angle back toward the northeast and the downtown area. This portion of the route would take them through transitional zone between the warehouse district and the more established downtown neighborhoods, would involve several more turns and traffic lights before connecting to Martin Luther King Boulevard for the final approach to their destination. The route was working well, they were making good time, traffic remained light. Rohan was feeling increasingly confident that his decision to avoid the highway had been correct choice. But then, as they were stopped at red light at the intersection of Portola and Hayes Street, waiting for the signal to change so they could continue north, something unexpected occurred that would transform what had been routine route adjustment into something more consequential. "Wait, can you pull over for a second?" Priya's voice came from the back seat, sudden and urgent enough that Rohan glanced in the rearview mirror to see what had prompted the request. She was looking out the passenger side window at something on the street they were stopped next to, her expression showing interest or recognition that suggested she'd noticed something relevant to her work. Rohan checked traffic. No one was behind them, they were in right lane that would allow pulling to curb without blocking other vehicles, and maneuvered the sedan to the curb as the light changed to green and the few cars that had been waiting ahead of them proceeded through the intersection. "What is it?" he asked, putting the car in park and following Priya's gaze to see what she'd noticed. They were stopped in front of small independent cafe called the Wayward Bean, one of the coffee shops that had opened in the warehouse district as the neighborhood gentrified, occupying ground floor of converted warehouse with large windows that looked into the cafe's interior. But what had caught Priya's attention wasn't the cafe itself but rather a flyer posted in the window, hand-lettered in colorful markers, announcing, "Volunteer for the river cleanup, today, 10 a.m., help restore our waterways. Meet at Riverside Park boat launch. River cleanup, Priya said, more to herself than to Rohan, pulling out her phone to photograph the flyer through the car window. I'd heard there was environmental organizing happening around the river pollution issues, but I didn't realize there was an event today. This could be worth following up on, might be good human interest angle about community environmental activism. She spent approximately 90 seconds photographing the flyer and making notes in her phone, while Rohan waited patiently with the car idling at the curb. The interruption was slightly odd. They weren't typically stopping during commutes to appointments unless absolutely necessary, but not particularly concerning. They still had comfortable time margin before the 9 a.m. interview. The delay was only a minute or two, and Priya's work often involved noticing and following up on unexpected information sources that might lead to stories. Okay, sorry about that, Priya said, looking up from her phone. I wanted to get the details before I forgot. We can continue. Rohan pulled away from the curb, rejoined the traffic flow, continued navigating the surface street route toward downtown. The brief stop had felt like minor interruption, had taken them maybe 2 minutes total, had slightly disrupted the smooth flow of their journey but hadn't created any significant delay. He didn't think much about it beyond noting that Priya had been interested in the river cleanup flyer, just filed it as one of the countless small incidents that occurred during days spent driving clients around the city. They continued north on Hayes for several more blocks, then turned right onto Martin Luther King Boulevard, which would take them northeast back toward downtown. The route was working exactly as Rohan had anticipated. They were making good time, were actually slightly ahead of where they'd probably be if they'd taken the highway route given the congestion that had been developing there. His route decision was proving correct. They'd arrive at the interview location with time to spare. Everything was proceeding smoothly. Until they reached the intersection where MLK Boulevard would have connected them back to Montgomery Street for the final approach to downtown, and discovered that their usual route was completely blocked by accident scene that had occurred sometime in the past 20 or 30 minutes. The accident was substantial, involved 3 vehicles, had evidently occurred when vehicle attempting to turn left had been struck by vehicle proceeding straight through intersection, with third vehicle being struck subsequently as chain reaction. Emergency vehicles were present, 2 police cars, fire truck, ambulance, their lights creating the distinctive red and blue flashing that characterized emergency scenes. The intersection was completely blocked to through traffic, with police officer directing vehicles to turn around and seek alternative routes, with what appeared to be extensive backup of stopped vehicles extending back from the accident scene for several blocks. Rohan assessed the situation quickly. If they'd taken the highway route and then Montgomery Street as originally planned, they would have arrived at this intersection from the opposite direction and would currently be stuck in that backup of vehicles, would probably be sitting in non-moving traffic for unknown duration while the accident scene was processed and cleared. Instead, approaching from their current direction, they were able to simply turn left onto Cross Street and navigate around the accident scene through parallel routes, adding maybe 3 or 4 minutes to their journey but avoiding what would probably be 30-minute or longer delay if they'd been approaching from the other direction. The realization hit Rohan with unexpected force. His instinctive decision to take the alternative route hadn't just been about avoiding slightly heavier traffic on the highway approach. It had, without his conscious awareness or intention, routed them completely around major accident that would have made them substantially late for Priya's interview if they'd been on the originally planned route. The timing was remarkable. The accident must have occurred sometime after 7:45 a.m. when they departed Priya's apartment, but early enough that if they'd taken the highway route they'd have arrived at this intersection right around the time when traffic would have been backing up substantially behind the accident scene. "Look at that," Priya said from the back seat, also processing what they were seeing. "That's where we would have been if we'd taken your usual route, right?" "Yeah," Rohan confirmed, his voice quiet with the surprise of recognition. "If I'd gone the normal way, we'd be stuck in that backup right now. Probably would have made you late for your interview. So your instinct to take the detour saved us from sitting in that mess. I didn't know there was an accident, couldn't have known, it probably happened after we were already on Ashford. But somehow taking the alternative route meant we completely avoided it." They were both quiet for a moment, processing the unlikely timing, the way Rohan's route decision that had felt like just normal professional judgment had turned out to have consequences beyond just slightly more efficient travel. If it had been only about avoiding the accident, that would have been interesting coincidence but nothing particularly profound, just good luck that his route choice had happened to avoid delay that he couldn't have predicted. But it wasn't only about avoiding the accident. Because the alternative route had also taken them past the wayward bean where Priya had noticed the river cleanup flyer, had created the opportunity for that brief stop that might not have occurred if they'd been on the highway route, had introduced information about community environmental activism that Priya was now considering as potential story angle. The route change had created multiple unexpected outcomes, had shifted their morning in ways that neither of them could have anticipated when Rohan had made the simple decision to turn right onto Ashford Street instead of continuing toward the highway entrance. They arrived at the downtown restaurant at 8:51 a.m., 9 minutes before Priya's scheduled interview time, well within the comfortable margin that professional punctuality required. Priya thanked Rohan and entered the restaurant to meet with the city council member, while Rohan parked nearby to wait for the interview's conclusion. The wait would probably be 60 to 90 minutes based on typical interview duration, would give Rohan time to catch up on email and to review schedule for the rest of the day's driving obligations. But instead of immediately turning to his phone, Rohan sat for several minutes just thinking about the morning's route and its unexpected consequences. He was a pragmatic person, wasn't prone to mystical thinking about fate or destiny or cosmic forces guiding human decisions toward predetermined outcomes. But he also couldn't quite shake the feeling that something more than just random chance had been operating in his route decision and its cascading effects. What if he hadn't trusted his instinct about the traffic? What if he'd stuck with the planned highway route despite the slight slowdown he'd observed? They would have been caught in the accident backup, Priya would have been late for an important interview, the lateness might have affected the interview's quality or the council member's impression of Priya's professionalism. And they wouldn't have passed the wayward bean, wouldn't have seen the river cleanup flyer, wouldn't have had whatever stories or connections might emerge from Priya following up on that environmental activism angle. Or going further back, what if he'd never developed the instinct for reading traffic conditions that had prompted his route change? What if he was less experienced driver who just followed GPS recommendations without questioning them? What if he'd been too rigid in his route planning to consider alternatives even when conditions suggested they might be advisable? The outcome would have been different, not dramatically different in ways that would have been catastrophic, but different enough that both his and Priya's days would have unfolded along different trajectories. The reflection wasn't leading him toward any clear conclusions about determinism versus free will or about whether some supernatural force had been guiding his decision. But it was making him more aware of how seemingly minor choices, turning right instead of left, trusting instinct instead of GPS, being willing to adapt plans based on real-time conditions, could create cascading effects that weren't predictable in advance but that in retrospect revealed themselves as consequential. Priya's interview concluded around 10:15 a.m., slightly longer than typical but still within normal range. She returned to the car looking satisfied with how the conversation had gone, settled into the back seat and confirmed that she needed to return to the Chronicle office for the remainder of the morning to write up her notes and to work on other stories. As Rohan pulled away from the curb to begin the drive to the office, Priya mentioned that she'd been thinking during the interview about the river cleanup flyer they'd seen. "I'm going to try to get down to Riverside Park around lunchtime," she said. "Want to see what the cleanup event looks like, talk to some of the organizers and volunteers, see if there's a story there about community environmental activism that might work as feature. It's interesting timing, there's been increasing concern about the river's water quality, some recent studies showing pollution levels that are concerning, but I haven't seen much coverage of what community groups are doing in response. Could be good angle." Rohan acknowledged her plan, filed it mentally as information about her afternoon schedule that might affect his own driving obligations. But he was also thinking about the chain of causation. His route decision had led them past the cafe had displayed the flyer had caught Priya's attention, and now she was planning to investigate what might become a significant story. Each link in that chain had been individually unremarkable, just normal decision-making and professional awareness, but collectively they were creating pathway that neither of them could have predicted when the day had started. Over the following weeks, the consequences of that Wednesday morning's route continued to unfold in ways that neither Rohan nor Priya could have anticipated. Priya did attend the river cleanup event, did interview the organizers and volunteers, did discover that there was substantial story about community environmental activism that had been operating largely without mainstream media attention. The story grew from initial feature article about the cleanup event into multi-part investigative series about the river's pollution sources and the various stakeholders, industrial facilities, municipal water management, agricultural operations in the watershed, whose practices were contributing to water quality degradation. The series won Regional Journalism Award in January, was cited as example of excellent local investigative reporting that brought attention to environmental issues that affected community health and quality of life. The recognition advanced Priya's career, led to job offers from larger newspapers in bigger cities, eventually led to her accepting position at respected national publication though she'd remain based in San Veritas. The professional advancement was gratifying and was result of her own skilled reporting and writing, but the initial lead that had launched the investigation had come from noticing a flyer during the detour that Rohan's route decision had created. Priya acknowledged this connection when she and Rohan discussed the series after its publication. "I keep thinking about that Wednesday morning," she told him during one of their regular drives. "If you'd taken the normal route, if we'd been stuck in that accident backup, we wouldn't have gone past that cafe, I wouldn't have seen the cleanup flyer, I wouldn't have gone to the event." The whole investigative series came from that random detour. It's strange to think about how different things would be from one route decision. "It wasn't entirely random," Rohan replied, though he wasn't quite sure how to articulate what he meant. "I made a choice based on what I was observing about traffic. But yeah, I couldn't have known what the consequences would be. I was just trying to get you to your interview on time. And you did get me there on time, ahead of time actually. But you also accidentally led me to one of the most important stories I've worked on. I should probably hire you as investigative assistant in addition to driver." They both laughed at that, but Rohan had been doing his own reflecting about the morning and about the broader patterns it seemed to reveal. The route decision hadn't been random, he'd made deliberate choice based on accumulated experience and instinct. But he also hadn't been able to predict what that choice would lead to beyond just avoiding some traffic congestion. The unpredictability didn't make the decision meaningless or purely arbitrary, but it did suggest that consequences of choices often extended beyond the immediate purposes those choices were meant to serve. For his own part, Rohan didn't experience dramatic career advancement or public recognition from the Wednesday morning's route. His life continued much as it had been: professional driving, regular client relationships including continued work with Priya, modest but adequate income, satisfactory but not spectacular existence. But he did notice subtle shift in how he thought about his work and about decision-making more generally. He'd always taken pride in his route expertise, in his ability to navigate efficiently and to make good real-time decisions about how to handle unpredictable traffic conditions. But he'd thought about that expertise primarily in narrow terms, as skill that made him good at his job, that allowed him to provide reliable service to clients, that distinguished him from less experienced drivers. The Wednesday morning had suggested that the expertise might have significance beyond just professional competence, that decisions made for one purpose could have consequences that extended into domains he hadn't been considering when making those decisions. The recognition didn't lead him to adopt grandiose sense of his choice's cosmic importance or to become paralyzed by overthinking every minor decision. But it did make him slightly more aware of possibility that even routine professional decisions might matter in ways that weren't immediately apparent, that paying attention and trusting instinct and being willing to adapt plans might create opportunities that rigid adherence to plans would foreclose. 2 years after the Wednesday morning route decision, Rohan was still working as professional driver, was still based in San Veritas though his client roster had evolved somewhat as some clients had moved away or had changed their transportation needs and as new clients had been added. Priya was no longer his regular client, she'd eventually accepted the national publication job that required relocating to New York, had moved away approximately 8 months after the River Pollution series had been published. Before leaving, she'd written recommendation letter for Rohan that had helped him secure several new professional driving contracts, had maintained friendly contact with occasional emails updating him on her career and asking about life in San Veritas. Rohan thought about the Wednesday morning occasionally, would remember it when encountering similar route decision situations or when hearing about accidents or delays on routes he'd chosen not to take. The memory was tinged with mild satisfaction. His route decision had worked out well in multiple ways, had contributed to outcomes that had been meaningful at least for Priya and arguably for the broader community that had benefited from the environmental reporting her River Pollution series had generated. But the memory also carried uncertainty about what lessons to draw from the experience, about whether it demonstrated anything generalizable beyond the specific circumstances of that particular morning. The uncertainty centered on question of agency and control. Rohan had made deliberate choice to take alternative route, had exercised professional judgment based on experience and instinct, had demonstrated skill in reading traffic conditions and making adaptive decisions. In that sense, the positive outcomes that had followed could be attributed at least partially to his competent professional practice, to his willingness to trust his expertise rather than just deferring to GPS recommendations. But he'd also had no awareness or intention regarding most of the consequences that had actually mattered. He hadn't known about the accident that they'd avoided, couldn't have known since it hadn't yet occurred when he'd made the route decision. He hadn't been trying to route them past the wayward bean or to create opportunity for Priya to notice the river cleanup flyer, that had been pure coincidence of timing and observation. The most significant outcomes of his decision had resulted from factors he hadn't controlled or even been aware of when making the decision. So was he responsible for those outcomes? Did his route decision deserve credit for the investigative series and its effects? Or were those outcomes just fortunate accidents that had happened to follow from decision he'd made for entirely different reasons? The question didn't have clear answer, seemed to involve both deliberate skill and pure chance in proportions that couldn't be precisely determined. What Rohan had settled on, after 2 years of occasional reflection, was acceptance that most decisions involve mixture of intention and accident, of control and contingency, of skill and luck. The Wednesday morning's route hadn't been purely one or the other, hadn't been just skilled navigation that deserved full credit for its outcomes, but also hadn't been just random luck that deserved no credit. Had been something in between, had been competent professional decision that had created conditions for positive outcomes without fully determining what those outcomes would be. The acceptance made him neither more nor less careful about route decisions. He'd always taken them seriously as essential aspect of professional competence, continued to take them seriously for same reasons. But it made him slightly more humble about claiming full control over outcomes, slightly more aware that even skilled decisions operated within contexts that included factors beyond the decision-maker's awareness or control, slightly more comfortable with uncertainty about whether specific choices deserved credit or blame for their eventual consequences. Sometimes the wrong choice leads you exactly where you need to be. Not because every mistake is secretly correct or because all roads lead to the same destination or because outcomes are predetermined regardless of choices. But because the distinction between right and wrong choices, between planned and unplanned routes, between intention and accident is often less clear than it appears in the moment when decisions are being made. Rohan's route decision on that Wednesday morning wasn't wrong. By most reasonable standards it was correct professional judgment that achieved its immediate purpose of delivering his client on time while avoiding traffic delays. But it was also unplanned in its most significant consequences, hadn't been designed to lead to environmental investigative reporting, had created those outcomes through chain of causation that included intentional skill and unintentional chance in proportions that couldn't be disentangled. The lesson isn't that all detours are valuable or that unpredictable consequences make planning useless or that you should abandon deliberate decision-making in favor of pure improvisation. Rohan's expertise and his willingness to trust that expertise were essential to the positive outcomes. If he'd been less skilled or less confident in adapting his routes, they would have been stuck in the accident backup and the subsequent chain of events wouldn't have occurred. But the lesson is that even skilled decisions operate within contexts you don't fully control, create opportunities for outcomes you couldn't predict, sometimes matter most through their unintended consequences rather than through their intended purposes. So make deliberate choices based on whatever expertise and judgment you possess, but also remain open to possibilities that those choices might lead to outcomes you hadn't anticipated. Remain willing to notice and respond to opportunities that emerge along routes you're traveling even when those opportunities weren't why you chose those routes. Trust the journey even when, especially when, the journey deviates from plans you'd made or expectations you'd developed. The deviations aren't necessarily mistakes requiring correction, might be openings toward outcomes that serve purposes you hadn't known you were pursuing, might reveal destinations you didn't know you needed to reach. Embrace the unexpected not by abandoning intention but by holding intention lightly enough that accidents and contingencies can complement rather than disrupt your deliberate navigation. Sometimes the wrong choice leads you exactly where you need to be. Embrace the unexpected, trust the journey, and be StoryWise.